I keep the newspaper clipping in a wooden box now, wrapped in tissue paper that has yellowed like everything else from that time. But for 36 years, it lived in my Bible, pressed between Psalms and Proverbs, where I thought prayers might somehow reach across the years to wherever she had gone. Jamila Meyer, 8 years old, missing since November 17, 1964. The photograph showed a thin girl with dark braids and eyes that seemed too large for her face. Not frightened exactly, though that is how I remembered them. More like watchful, as if she had already learned that the world required constant vigilance even from children. I was 23 when she disappeared, young enough to still believe that caring deeply could change outcomes, old enough to understand that most people had stopped caring about anything except survival. The world that forgot her, the Germany of 1964, was not the Germany of war rubble and starvation, but neither was it the prosperous nation that would emerge in later decades. We existed in a strange in-between. The physical structures had been rebuilt, but the social fabric remained torn in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. The Müllerstrasse district where Jamila lived with her mother sat in the shadow of the Siemens factory, close enough to hear the shift whistles, far enough to remain forgotten. 3-story apartment blocks, constructed hastily in the 1950s, housed families who worked the factory floors, cleaned the offices, and disappeared into the machinery of economic recovery. I lived 2 streets over, in a slightly better building where my husband's steady work as a postal clerk afforded us a 2-room apartment with our own toilet. This small distinction, our own toilet, marked the difference between respectability and poverty in those days. The Saturday morning market smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, of potatoes stored in cellars, and the metallic tang of butcher shops. Women gathered not just to buy vegetables but to exchange the week's small disasters. It was there, among the turnips and cabbages, that we watched Frau Meyer disappear in stages. The mother's slow vanishing. Helga Meyer came to market less and less frequently that autumn of 1964. When she did appear, she moved like someone underwater, each step requiring conscious effort. Her skin held a gray pallor that we recognized but did not name. Illness was private shame in our world. "Is your daughter well?" I asked her once, making conversation while selecting turnips. She looked at me with such naked exhaustion that I stepped back involuntarily. "Jamila is a good girl. She helps me." Then she gathered her single cabbage and left, her thin coat inadequate against the wind. I should have asked more. I should have followed her home. I should have done something other than select my vegetables and return to my warm apartment and my healthy children. But I didn't. None of us did. The father who left Jamila's father had walked away one morning in March, leaving behind a wife too ill to work full-time, and a daughter who already understood that survival meant silence. He was one of those men who could not outrun what the war had planted in their minds. The neighborhood women whispered about him with practiced neutrality. The war broke something in him, they said, which was both explanation and dismissal. We had learned to accept that some men returned from the war alive but not intact, and their families paid the price for decades. No one blamed him directly, but no one helped the family he abandoned either. A child raising, a mother. What I learned later, what we all should have seen if we had looked, was that by November 1964, 8-year-old Jamila Meyer was essentially caring for an invalid mother alone. She woke at 5:30 each morning, dressed herself in the same gray dress she wore most days, and prepared her mother's medicine, pills acquired through charity clinics, their purpose mysterious to a child, but their administration absolutely necessary. At 6, she walked alone to the bakery 3 blocks away, where the owner saved day-old bread he couldn't sell. Jamila was allowed to take 2 rolls on credit that her mother could no longer pay. School attendance became sporadic. The teacher noted absences in her ledger: 8 days present in September, 4 in October, only 2 in the first half of November. She sent letters home that no one answered. She spoke to the headmaster, who reminded her they had 50 children in similar circumstances. What did she expect him to do? By afternoon, Jamila would return to the apartment where her mother spent most days in bed, coughing into rags she washed and reused. The child would attempt homework by the window's fading light, prepare simple meals of bread and thin soup, and eventually curl up beside her mother in their single room. No privacy, no childhood, no one noticing. The system that failed a social worker did visit once, in late October. Fräulein Schneider, a young woman overwhelmed by 200 families in crisis, climbed the 3 flights of stairs and knocked on the door marked Meyer. Helga answered after prolonged knocking. She appeared ill but coherent. The apartment was small but clean. The child was not present, supposedly at school, though this was never verified. The mother stated the situation was temporary, that her husband would return soon with employment. No immediate danger observed. Case closed pending follow-up in 6 months. The follow-up never occurred. Fräulein Schneider transferred to another district in November. Jamila disappeared 2 weeks later, and no one connected the dots. Until it was far too late. The morning she vanished, November 17, 1964, began like most mornings in that apartment. Jamila woke in the dark, dressed in her inadequate coat, and left while her mother still slept. A neighbor heard the door close at 5:45. She did not appear at the bakery at 6. The owner noticed but assumed the family had found another source of food. Perhaps a relative had finally helped. He was busy with paying customers. He did not report the absence. She did not arrive at school at 7:30. The teacher marked her absent as she had been absent more often than present. No one investigated. By noon, Helga Meyer was too ill to leave her bed. She assumed Jamila was at school. By 3 in the afternoon, when Jamila should have returned, the mother was drifting in and out of feverish consciousness. She did not register her daughter's absence. By 6 in the evening, when darkness had fallen completely, Helga finally understood. She tried to rise to seek help, to find her child. She collapsed on the stairs. A neighbor found her unconscious at 11 that night and called an ambulance. Police were not notified until 3 in the morning on November. 12 hours lost. The trail already cold. The search that barely happened. The initial investigation lasted 45 days. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking questions to people who had trained themselves not to see. They distributed poor-quality photocopies of Jamila's school, picture to shops and train stations. They interviewed the mother once in her hospital bed, as she deteriorated before their eyes. They located the father in Munich 12 days after the disappearance. He claimed he had not contacted the family since March. He showed no interest in his missing daughter. He suggested she had probably run away from an intolerable situation. The officers, overwhelmed with cases of organized crime and economic fraud, began to believe this narrative. A troubled child from a broken home, a mother too ill to provide care, a voluntary disappearance, tragic but not criminal. By late December, the active investigation closed. The file went to archives. Jamila Meyer became a statistic, a name in a ledger, a face on an aging piece of paper that would fade with each passing year. My promise. I visited Helga Meyer in the hospital 3 times before she died. The first visit, she gripped my hand with surprising strength and begged me to promise I would watch for Jamila, would recognize her if she came back, would tell her that her mother never stopped believing. I made that promise to a dying woman, and I have kept it for 54 years. The second visit, she showed me a small box containing everything Jamila had left behind. A hairbrush with dark strands still tangled in the bristles, a school primer with careful handwriting, a cloth doll with button eyes. When she comes home, Helga whispered, these will help her remember. The third visit, in January 1970, she no longer recognized me. She thought I was Jamila. You're so grown up now, she said, touching my face with skeletal fingers. Did it hurt, being away so long? I held her hand and lied. No, Mama. It didn't hurt at all. She died later that night, still believing her daughter would return. The system that failed a social worker did visit once in late October. Fräulein Schneider, a young woman overwhelmed by 200 families in crisis, climbed the 3 flights of stairs and knocked on the door marked Meyer. Helga answered after prolonged knocking. She appeared ill, but coherent. The apartment was small but clean. The child was not present, supposedly at school, though this was never verified. The mother stated the situation was temporary, that her husband would return soon with employment. No immediate danger observed. Case closed pending follow-up in 6 months. The follow-up never occurred. Fräulein Schneider transferred to another district in November. Jamila disappeared 2 weeks later, and no one connected the dots until it was far too late. The morning she vanished, November 17, 1964, began like most mornings in that apartment. Jamila woke in the dark, dressed in her inadequate coat, and left while her mother still slept. A neighbor heard the door close at 5:45. She did not appear at the bakery at 6. The owner noticed but assumed the family had found another source of food. Perhaps a relative had finally helped. He was busy with paying customers. He did not report the absence. She did not arrive at school at 7:30. The teacher marked her absent, as she had been absent more often than present. No one investigated. By noon, Helga Meyer was too ill to leave her bed. She assumed Jamila was at school. By 3 in the afternoon, when Jamila should have returned, the mother was drifting in and out of feverish consciousness. She did not register her daughter's absence. By 6 in the evening, when darkness had fallen completely, Helga finally understood. She tried to rise, to seek help, to find her child. She collapsed on the stairs. A neighbor found her unconscious at 11 that night and called an ambulance. Police were not notified until 3 in the morning on November 18th. 12 hours lost. The trail already cold. The search that barely happened. The initial investigation lasted 45 days. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking questions to people who had trained themselves not to see. They distributed poor-quality photocopies of Jamila's school picture to shops and train stations. They interviewed the mother once in her hospital bed, as she deteriorated before their eyes. They located the father in Munich 12 days after the disappearance. He claimed he had not contacted the family since March. He showed no interest in his missing daughter. He suggested she had probably run away from an intolerable situation. The officers, overwhelmed with cases of organized crime and economic fraud, began to believe this narrative. A troubled child from a broken home. A mother too ill to provide care. A voluntary disappearance. Tragic, but not criminal. By late December, the active investigation closed. The file went to archives. Jamila Meyer became a statistic, a name in a ledger, a face on an aging piece of paper that would fade with each passing year. My promise. I visited Helga Meyer in the hospital 3 times before she died. The first visit, she gripped my hand with surprising strength and begged me to promise I would watch for Jamila, would recognize her if she came back, would tell her that her mother never stopped believing. I made that promise to a dying woman, and I have kept it for 54 years. The second visit, she showed me a small box containing everything Jamila had left behind. A hairbrush with dark strands still tangled in the bristles, a school primer with careful handwriting, a cloth doll with button eyes. When she comes home, Helga whispered, these will help her remember. The third visit, in January 1970, she no longer recognized me. She thought I was Jamila. You're so grown up now, she said, touching my face with skeletal fingers. Did it hurt being away so long? I held her hand and lied. No, Mama, it didn't hurt at all. She died later that night, still believing her daughter would return. To understand how Jamila Meyer disappeared, you must first understand how she had already become invisible long before that. November morning. The texture of poverty. Poverty in post-war Germany was not always the dramatic destitution of homelessness or starvation. More often, it was the grinding erosion of dignity through 1,000 small deprivations. It was wearing the same dress until the fabric thinned to transparency. It was day-old bread eaten without butter. It was cold rooms and persistent hunger and the constant calculation of which necessity to sacrifice. The Meyer apartment consisted of one room with a hot plate, a shared toilet down the hall, and a single window that faced the alley where garbage bins overflowed each Thursday. Helga and Jamila shared a narrow bed because there was no space for two. Their possessions fit in a single wardrobe: a few changes of clothing, Helga's wedding photograph, Jamila's school books, and the small collection of items that constituted childhood in extreme poverty. But the apartment was clean. This mattered enormously when the social worker visited. Cleanliness signaled that despite illness and abandonment, despite poverty that pressed in from all sides, Helga Meyer maintained standards. She was trying. She deserved the benefit of doubt. What the social worker could not measure was the cost of that cleanliness. The hours Jamila spent scrubbing floors while other children played. The exhaustion that made schoolwork impossible. The premature adulthood that carved itself into her posture, her voice, her eyes. The school's blindness. Grundschule Müllerstrasse served the factory district's children. Most arrived with some degree of deprivation, insufficient clothing, inadequate nutrition, parents too exhausted to attend school meetings or help with homework. The teachers, themselves overwhelmed and underpaid, learned to triage their concern. Jamila's teacher, Frau Elisabeth Braun, was not a cruel woman. She was a tired woman teaching 50 children in a classroom built for 30, with textbooks from the 1950s and no support staff. When Jamila began missing school with increasing frequency, Frau Braun noted it in her ledger. When the child fell asleep during lessons, Frau Braun let her rest rather than punish her. When Jamila's dress grew too small and too worn, Frau Braun mentioned it to the headmaster. "And what would you have me do?" he asked, spreading his hands. "We have 50 children in similar circumstances. The social services are overwhelmed. The parents are overwhelmed. We teach the children who come, and we note those who don't, and we hope that someone with more resources and authority will intervene before tragedy occurs." But no one did. And tragedy occurred anyway. I spoke with Frau Braun in 2001 after Jamila was found. She was 83 then, living in a nursing home, her hands twisted with arthritis. She wept when I showed her the photograph. "I remember her," she said. "A mouse of a girl, always in the back corner trying to disappear. I sent 3 letters home. I spoke to the headmaster twice. I even walked to the apartment once, but no one answered the door." She covered her face with those twisted hands. "I told myself I had done what I could, but I could have done more. I should have done more. I should have broken down that door." The neighborhoods. Collective amnesia. Here is the truth I have spent decades accepting. We all knew. Perhaps not the specific details, perhaps not the full extent of the crisis unfolding 2 flights up in Building C. But we knew that child was drowning, and we each found reasons not to throw a rope. Frau Zimmermann, who lived below the Meyers, complained about the coughing that kept her awake but never knocked on the door to ask if help was needed. "It wasn't my place," she told police after the disappearance. "You don't interfere in other families' private matters." Herr Koch, who ran the corner shop, allowed Jamila to take bread on credit that would never be repaid. He felt this was charitable. He never asked why an 8-year-old was shopping alone at dawn, or why she never came with her mother anymore, or why her coat was inadequate for November cold. I myself saw Jamila 3 times in the weeks before she vanished. Each time I thought, someone should help that family. And each time I went home to my warm apartment and my healthy children, and I convinced myself that someone else would act, that the authorities knew, that the school was handling it, that surely a child could not be drowning this badly in the middle of a functioning city. We were all wrong, and our collective failure to act became the mechanism of her disappearance. The mechanics of vanishing. Here is how a child disappears in a city of millions. First, she becomes invisible through the normalizing of her vulnerability. Her absences become routine. Her hunger becomes expected. Her increasingly desperate situation becomes background noise in a neighborhood where many families struggle. Second, the systems meant to catch her fail in sequence, each failure compounding the next. The school notes but does not act. The social services visit once and close the case. The neighbors notice but do not intervene. The police, when finally notified, treat the case as low priority. Another troubled child from a broken home, probably a runaway. Third, And most critically, no single person sees the complete picture. The teacher sees absences. The shopkeeper sees an unsupervised child. The neighbor hears coughing. The social worker sees a clean apartment. Each fragment of information remains isolated, never assembling into recognition of catastrophic neglect. Jamila Meyer fell through the gaps between institutions, between good intentions, between people who meant well but did not act. She disappeared not because someone took her, but because no one held on. The day itself, reconstructing November 17th, 1964. What actually happened that morning? I have spent decades assembling fragments, imagining possibilities, trying to understand the moment when a child stepped out of her life and into 36 years of erasure. Jamila left the apartment at 5:45, a neighbor confirmed. She was wearing her gray coat, inadequate, but the only one she owned. She carried no bag, no possessions. She was going to the bakery, as she did most mornings. She did not arrive at the bakery. Between her apartment door and a destination 3 blocks away, something happened. Or perhaps nothing happened. Perhaps Jamila simply chose, in that moment, to walk in a different direction, to step away from the impossible burden of caring for a dying mother, to seek help she did not know how to ask for. Or perhaps she was confused, disoriented by hunger and exhaustion. Perhaps she got lost in streets that should have been familiar. Or perhaps someone spoke to her, offered help, and she was desperate enough to accept. We will never know the exact sequence of events. What we know is this. An 8-year-old girl walked out into a November morning and did not return, and the city barely noticed. The mother's final years. Helga Meyer survived her daughter's disappearance by 5 years and 2 months. It was not living so much as prolonged dying, punctuated by brief periods of lucidity when the pain of Jamila's absence overwhelmed even the pain of her illness. Hospital records document 23 admissions between November 1964 and January 1970. Each time she was treated for acute symptoms, respiratory failure, malnutrition, dehydration, and each time she recovered just enough to return to the empty apartment where she waited for a daughter who never came home. The nurses remembered her. The woman who lost her child, they called her. She would ask every visitor, every doctor, every cleaning person, "Have you seen my Jamila? She's 8 years old, dark braids. She's been gone a while now, but she'll come back. I know she'll come back." As her illness progressed, time became fluid. Sometimes she believed Jamila had been gone for weeks, sometimes for years. Sometimes she seemed to forget entirely, and in those moments she would rest. But then memory would return, and with it, the unbearable knowledge. Police visited twice in those 5 years, checking if Jamila had returned or contacted her mother. Both times, Helga begged them to continue searching. Both times they explained gently that the case was cold, that without new evidence there was nothing to pursue, that after this much time, they had to assume the worst. "But you don't know," Helga insisted. "You didn't find her. She could still come home." The second officer, younger and less practiced in delivering hopeless news, made the mistake of being honest. "Frau Meyer, children who disappear this completely, they usually don't come back." Helga stopped asking police for help after that, but she never stopped waiting. The inheritance of guilt. I inherited Helga Meyer's vigil, though I did not choose it consciously. After her death, I found myself unable to let go. The newspaper clipping remained in my Bible. The story remained in my thoughts. The promise remained binding. My husband, practical and kind, suggested after a few years that perhaps I should let it go. "You've mourned her," he said. "You've honored the mother's memory, but you cannot carry someone else's tragedy forever." But I could, and I did. I told myself I was keeping faith with a dying woman's wish. But truthfully, I was also keeping faith with my own failure. I was one of the neighbors who did nothing. I saw that child struggling and I turned away. Keeping vigil became my penance, my ongoing apology, my refusal to forget what forgetting had already cost. 36 years is enough time to raise children, bury parents, Watch the world transform. Enough time for history to become memory, and memory to become myth. Enough time for a missing child to become a story people tell, rather than a person people seek. But not enough time, I learned, for some promises to expire. The first decade, 1965-1975. The 1970s brought the Germany that we had been promised in the rebuilding years. The economy solidified into genuine prosperity. Social welfare systems expanded. The same neighborhood where Jamila disappeared began to gentrify. Factory workers displaced by young professionals, tenements renovated into fashionable lofts. I raised my 3 children through those years. My oldest daughter married in 1972. My son entered university in 1974. My husband and I built a good, ordinary life measured in birthday cakes and school concerts and Sunday dinners with extended family. But every November 17th, I lit a candle in the window facing Müllerstrasse. My children asked why, and I told them about the little girl who vanished, about her mother who died waiting, about the promise I had made to a dying woman. They accepted it as one of their mother's eccentricities, like saving string or refusing to waste bread. The case itself became historical curiosity during these years. Occasionally, a journalist would write a retrospective piece about unsolved cases, and Jamila's photograph would appear again. The articles always ended the same way. Remains unsolved to this day. If you have any information, no one ever did. The parallel life. What we didn't know, what none of us knew. What we could not have known was that Jamila Meyer was alive, not thriving, not building a life, but surviving in the margins where broken children learn to hide. The details emerged only gradually after 2000, pieced together from fragmentary records, half-remembered testimonies, and the scattered recollections of a traumatized mind. But the outlines were clear enough. Jamila had not been abducted. She had not been murdered. She had been lost. Lost in the machinery of a social services system that was not yet equipped to track children across jurisdictions, lost in the gaps between bureaucracies that did not communicate, lost in the assumption that missing poor children were runaways who would eventually return home. She had wandered that November morning, cold and hungry and desperate, until someone noticed her. A social worker, perhaps, or a police officer, or simply a concerned citizen. She was brought to a children's home. She was frightened, possibly in shock, and when asked her name, she either could not remember or chose not to say. This happens more often than people realize. Traumatized children sometimes bury their identities as a form of protection. If you have no name, you have no past. If you have no past, perhaps you have no pain. She became Anna Schmidt in the Munich Children's Home System. The name was generic enough to fit any lost child. She was fed, clothed, provided with basic education. She existed in the system for 5 years, from age 8 to 13, without anyone connecting her to the missing child from Berlin. How is this possible? Because in 1964, Germany's child welfare systems were still regional, still rebuilding from wartime destruction, still learning to coordinate across jurisdictions. A missing child report filed in Berlin did not automatically populate databases in Munich, and a found child who would not or could not provide accurate identifying information simply became whoever the paperwork said she was. The second decade, 1975-1985. In 1978, my husband died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 52 years old, vital and present one morning, gone by afternoon. The foundation of my adult life vanished in hours. My children rallied around me. They were grown now, capable of reversing roles, of caring for the mother who had cared for them. They helped me through the grief, through the practical matters of death, through the reconstruction of identity that widows undergo. But it was my oldest daughter who noticed what I was holding when she arrived to help sort through her father's belongings. The newspaper clipping, creased and yellowed, that I had moved from my Bible to a small frame on my dresser. "You still keep her picture?" she said softly. I made a promise, I replied. Mama, she would be 32 years old now. If she's alive. If she's alive, I agreed. But I don't keep the promise because I believe she's alive. I keep it because I failed when she was. My daughter understood then, I think. The vigil was not about hope. It was about witness, about refusing to let Jamila Meyer disappear twice, once from the world, once from memory. Jamila's second identity, 1972-1985. At 13, Anna Schmidt aged out of the children's home and entered the foster care system. She was placed with a family in Hamburg where she lived for 6 years. The records describe a withdrawn, uncommunicative girl who struggled in school, who startled at loud noises, who sometimes woke screaming from nightmares she could not describe. The foster family tried. They were not unkind. But they were also not equipped to handle a profoundly traumatized child who could not articulate her trauma. When Anna was 19, she left their home and simply disappeared into the urban landscape. For the next decade, she moved through a series of temporary identities and temporary shelters. Sometimes she used the name Lena Müller, sometimes Maria Becker. Sometimes she provided no name at all. She worked occasional jobs, cleaning offices, washing dishes, sorting inventory in warehouses. She slept in homeless shelters, in group homes, in the apartments of people who would let her stay until she inevitably moved on. She was visible to institutions but invisible as herself. Social workers saw her. Police occasionally moved her along from places where homeless people were not welcome. Hospital emergency rooms treated her for malnutrition, for infections, for the physical toll of poverty and dislocation. But no one saw Jamila Meyer, because Jamila Meyer had become a ghost haunting her own life, unable to return to an identity she could barely remember. The third decade, 1985-1995. I retired from my position as a hospital clerk in 1987. My children were established in their own lives. My grandchildren were arriving one after another, filling my days with the joys and exhaustions of second-generation caregiving. I began volunteering at Charité Hospital, working with elderly patients in the psychiatric ward. Many had dementia or cognitive decline. Many arrived without identification or family. My role was simple human presence, sitting with confused patients, speaking calmly during distress, helping nurses understand fragments of personal history that might guide treatment. The irony was not lost on me. I spent my retirement with people who had lost themselves while maintaining vigil for a woman who had been lost by everyone else. Every November 17th, I lit the candle. My granddaughter Emma, 7 years old in 1985, asked about the picture in the frame. "Who is the little girl, Oma?" I told her Jamila's story. Not the full weight of institutional failure and neighborhood neglect, and she was too young for that, but the essence. A child who disappeared, a mother who never stopped believing, a promise that must be kept. "Didn't anyone care?" Emma asked. I had no good answer then. I still don't. The approaching convergence, 1995-2000. By 1995, I was 64 years old. My body was beginning the negotiations with decline that age demands. My hands shook slightly. My memory for recent events became unreliable, but I could recall with perfect clarity the afternoon in 1964 when I chose not to follow Helga Meyer home, not to ask if she needed help, not to look too closely at the child in the inadequate coat. I transferred the newspaper clipping to a small frame on my dresser. Emma, now 17, told her friends about her grandmother who kept vigil for a missing girl from the 1960s. They thought I was eccentric. Perhaps I was. But eccentric or not, I could not let go. The promise had become part of my identity. I was the woman who remembered Jamila Meyer. And as long as I remembered, she had not completely disappeared. In 1999, I turned 68. My doctor gently suggested I had perhaps 5 good years remaining before age took its inevitable toll. I found myself praying not that Jamila was alive, that seemed impossibly unlikely after 35 years, but that I might know what happened before I died, that I might keep my promise completely. The universe, it seemed, was listening. November 2000, the 36th. Anniversary approaches. The anniversary approached with particular weight that year. 36 years. Jamila would be 44 years old if she lived. I would be 69 in December. Time was rendering my vigil increasingly abstract. My granddaughter Emma visited on November 15th. She found me, sitting with the framed photograph, the candle already lit, though the sun had not yet set. "Oma," she said gently, "you've honored your promise for 36 years. No one could ask for more." "I know," I said, "but promises aren't measured by time or reasonableness, they're measured by keeping or breaking, and I haven't yet kept this one completely." She kissed my forehead and left me with my vigil. 2 days later, November 17th, 2000, I woke early and dressed for my volunteer shift at the hospital. I would work until noon, then come home and light the anniversary candle, as I had done for 36 years. I did not know as I buttoned my coat and picked up my handbag that the promise I made in 1970 was about to be kept in the most unexpected way possible. I did not know that Jamila Meyer was less than 2 kilometers away, about to collapse in a morning market. I did not know that. Within hours, I would be calling her by name for the first time in 36 years. November 17th, 2000. The morning arrived gray and cold, typical of Munich in late autumn. I dressed in layers, coat, scarf, gloves, and made my way to the Viktualienmarkt to buy vegetables before my volunteer shift. At the hospital. The market was busy but not crowded. Vendors called out prices for winter vegetables. The smell of roasted almonds mixed with the sharper scent of cold air and damp cobblestones. I moved through familiar rhythms, selecting potatoes and carrots for Sunday dinner. She appeared at the edge of my vision. A woman, perhaps in her 40s, though it was hard to tell. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, a man's coat over a thin dress, 2 scarves wound around her neck, boots that had seen better decades. Her hair, streaked with gray, hung in uneven strands around a face that was both aged and strangely childlike. I noticed her the way you notice weather or traffic, present but not demanding attention. The market always had a few people drifting at the margins, the unhoused and the unwell, looking for dropped coins or discarded food. But then she stumbled. Not a trip over cobblestones, but a deeper loss of equilibrium. Her hand reached for a vendor's table and missed. Her knees began to buckle, and the vendor, busy with customers, did not notice. I dropped my shopping bag and moved toward her. Other shoppers stepped back. The instinctive recoil from public distress, from poverty's visible markers, from the fear that whatever has broken this person might be contagious. "Call an ambulance," I said sharply to the fruit vendor, kneeling beside the woman as she crumpled onto the cobblestones. The first words. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her skin held the gray pallor I had learned to recognize in my hospital work. Serious dehydration, malnutrition, systemic crisis. I checked her pulse, fast and thready. I loosened the scarves around her neck to help her breathe. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused. Her lips moved. I leaned close to hear. "Mama?" she whispered. The voice was thin, uncertain. "Mama, I couldn't find the bakery, I got lost." The words were German, but the cadence was wrong. Childlike phrasing from an adult mouth. I had heard this before in dementia patients, the regression to earlier states of being. "It's all right," I said, gently. "Help is coming. You're safe now." Her eyes closed again. "Tell Mama I tried. Tell her I'm sorry I got lost." The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. I rode with her, providing what information I could observe to the paramedics. Approximately 45 years old, severely malnourished. Possible hypothermia, altered mental status suggesting either intoxication or neurological event. "Do you know her name?" the paramedic asked. "No," I said. "She hasn't been coherent." But even as I spoke, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness. The way she said, "Mama." The reference to the bakery, the apology for getting lost, the hospital. They brought her to Charité where I volunteered. Pure coincidence, except that coincidence is sometimes just patterns we cannot yet see. I stayed as they admitted her to the emergency ward, as they hooked her to IVs and monitors, as they ran tests and consulted and began the slow process of stabilization, I should have gone home. My volunteer shift was over. This woman was not my patient, not my responsibility. But I stayed. Something held me there. Some instinct I could not name. The nurse's observation. By early afternoon, the woman had stabilized enough to move from emergency to a regular ward. Still unconscious but breathing steadily, her vital signs improving with hydration and warmth. A nurse I knew, Schwester Margaret, came to check on her. She looked at the chart, then at the patient, then back at the chart. No. Identification, she asked. Nothing. She collapsed in the market. Schwester Margaret frowned. She's been saying something in her sleep. The same words over and over. What words? It sounds like Jamila. And something about bread. The world tilted. I stood very still, my heart suddenly loud. In my ears. Say that again. Jamila, she keeps repeating it. Jamila needs bread. Jamila got lost. Mama, where's Jamila? My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my coat pockets and felt the shape of my keys, my wallet, anchoring myself in the present moment even as the past rushed forward. I need to go home, I said. I'll be back in an hour. The newspaper clipping. I had lived in the same apartment for 42 years. I knew exactly where everything was, even in the gathering dusk. I went directly to my bedroom, to the dresser where the framed photograph sat. Jamila Meyer, 8 years old. Missing since November 17, 1964. I picked up the frame with shaking hands and studied the face I had memorized over 36 years. Dark braids, large watchful eyes, thin face with prominent cheekbones. Then I forced myself to remember the woman in the hospital bed. Gray-streaked hair. Yes, but the same texture. Eyes that had been closed, but the shape of the face beneath the age and malnutrition. I could not be certain. 36 years changes everything. An 8-year-old becomes a 44-year-old. Features shift, bodies age. The child in the photograph and the woman in the hospital bed seemed to belong to different worlds entirely, but she was saying the name. On November 17th, after getting lost going to a bakery, I removed the photograph from its frame, wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, and returned to the hospital. The vigil begins. The woman remained unconscious through that first night. I sat beside her bed, the photograph in my lap, trying to reconcile the two images. Hospital staff drifted in and out, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, speaking in the hushed tones of professional care. Schwester Margaret brought me coffee around midnight. You should go home, rest. She's stable now. I know, I said, but I need to stay. She looked at the photograph in my lap. Who is that? A little girl who went missing 36 years ago. Today, November 17th, 1964. Schwester Margaret's eyes widened. She looked from the photograph to the woman in the bed, then back again. You think? I don't know. But she keeps saying the name. And the details match. And today is the anniversary. After 36 years? How is that possible? I don't know, I repeated. But I made a promise once to watch for her. And I've kept that promise for 36 years. I need to know. Schwester Margarete squeezed my shoulder and left me to my vigil. The awakening. She opened her eyes at dawn. The gray light of November 18th was just beginning to filter through the hospital window. I had dozed in the chair beside her bed, the photograph still in my lap, and I woke to the sound of her stirring. Her eyes moved slowly, taking in the hospital room, the IV in her arm, the monitors beeping softly. Confusion, then fear, crossed her face. She tried to sit up. It's all right, I said quickly, leaning forward. You're in a hospital. You collapsed. Yesterday. You're safe. She stared at me, and I could see her mind working, trying to place me, trying to understand where she was and how she had arrived here. Do you know your name? I asked gently. She opened her mouth, closed it again, her brow furrowed with concentration. She shook her head, frustrated. Sometimes, Elsa. sometimes Maria. I don't. They keep changing it. Who keeps changing it? The people, the papers, they write down different names. Her voice was thin, uncertain, with the same childlike quality I had heard when she collapsed. I can't remember which one is real. My heart was pounding. Can I show you something? She nodded, wary. I held up the newspaper clipping, the photograph of an 8-year-old girl with dark braids. Do you know who this is? She took the paper with trembling hands. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then tears began sliding down her face, silent and continuous. That's Jamila, she whispered. That's Jamila Meyer. She lived on Müllerstrasse with her mama. She went to get bread one morning and she got lost. I could barely breathe. How do you know this? She looked up at me, tears still flowing. Because I'm Jamila. I think I'm Jamila. I was Jamila before everything, before I forgot. The confirmation. I called the hospital administrator immediately. Within an hour, they had contacted the police, who located the cold case file from 1964. They brought the file to the hospital, along with a detective who specialized in missing persons cases. The detective, a woman in her 50s named Frau Schmidt, sat beside the bed and spoke gently. We have some questions, if you feel able to answer them. The woman in the bed, Jamila, I was already thinking of her as Jamila, nodded. Do you remember your mother's name? Helga Meyer. The answer came without hesitation. She was sick. She coughed all the time. She tried to hide it, but I knew. Frau Schmidt consulted the file. Do you remember your address? Müllerstrasse, Building C, 3rd floor. We shared the toilet with Frau Zimmerman downstairs. She complained about Mama's coughing. The detective's pen moved quickly. Do you remember your father? Jamila's face clouded. He left. In the spring. March, I think. He didn't say goodbye. Mama cried for 3 days and then she stopped crying and got sick instead. Do you remember what happened on November 17, 1964? The question hung in the air. Jamila's hands gripped the thin hospital blanket. Her breathing quickened. I was going to the bakery to get bread from Herr Koch, but I was so cold and my head hurt and I couldn't remember which way to go. The streets looked wrong. Everything looked wrong. She was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out. A woman stopped me. She asked if I was lost. I said yes. She said she would help me find my mama. But she brought me to a building with other children, and they asked me my name, and I couldn't. I was so, scared I couldn't. She began to hyperventilate. Frau Schmidt reached out, took her hand. It's all right. You don't have to remember everything right now. But Jamila shook her head. I never found my way back. I tried to tell them about Mama, that she needed her medicine, that she would be worried, but they didn't understand, or they didn't believe me, and after a while I stopped trying. It was easier to be Anna. Anna didn't have a sick mama waiting. Anna didn't have to remember. The medical evidence. Over the next 3 days, they ran more tests. DNA testing was still relatively new. In 2000, expensive and time-consuming. But they located Helga Meyer's death certificate from 1970, which led them to the hospital where she had died, which still had tissue samples archived. The match would take weeks to confirm definitively. But there were other forms of evidence. Jamila had a small scar on her left knee from falling on broken glass when she was 6. The doctor's notes from 1962 were still in the municipal health archives. She remembered the names of her school teachers, her classmates, the layout of the apartment down to the crack in the ceiling that looked like a bird. She remembered the cloth doll with button eyes that her mother had sewn for her 4th birthday. And she remembered, with terrible clarity, the promise her mother had made her repeat every night before sleep. If anything happens, if we get separated, you tell them your name is Jamila Meyer. Tell them your mama is Helga Meyer on Müllerstrasse. You tell them to find me and I will come for you. But I couldn't. Jamila wept. When they asked, I couldn't remember. I was so scared and everything was confused and the words wouldn't come. And by the time I could remember again, I thought it was too late. I thought Mama must have forgotten me. I thought no one was looking anymore. I held her hand and told her the truth. Your mother never forgot you. She looked until the day she died. She believed you would come home. The psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Brenner, the psychiatric consultant, explained Jamila's condition to me in careful terms. Early onset dementia, yes, but also profound post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative identity disorder, and the accumulated damage of 3 decades living on the margins. Her mind has been trying to protect her from unbearable memories, he said. The different names, the fragmented identity. These were survival mechanisms, but they also prevented her from finding her way back to herself. Can she recover? I asked. He hesitated. She can improve. With proper treatment, medication, therapy, stability, she can have quality of life. But the damage is extensive. She will likely never fully recover her lost decades. Some memories may return. Many will not. And the cognitive decline is progressive. How long does she have? That's difficult to say. Perhaps 5 years with good care. Perhaps less. 5 years. Jamila had lost 36 and would have perhaps 5 remaining. The newspaper learns by November 22nd the story had leaked to the media. Missing child found after 36 years, read the headlines. Journalists descended on the hospital, demanding interviews, photographs, details. The hospital administration shielded Jamila from most of it. But they did allow one carefully managed press conference with Jamila seated beside Frau Schmidt and myself, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. I want to say thank you, she said, reading from a statement Dr. Brenner had helped her prepare. To the nurses and doctors who helped me, to the detective who believed me, and especially to Frau Wagner. She gestured to me, who kept her promise, who remembered when everyone else forgot. The journalists had questions, so many questions. What happened during those years? Where had she been? Why hadn't she come forward sooner? But we had agreed to protect her privacy, to shield her from having to explain decades of trauma and survival. Frau Schmidt fielded most questions, giving carefully minimal answers. The truth was, Jamila's lost years would remain mostly lost. She had fragments, memories of children's homes, foster families, shelters, streets. But the details were scattered, unreliable, sometimes contradictory. The woman who had called herself Anna and Maria and Elsa and a dozen other names had lived a dozen different lives, none of them quite real. The quiet moment that evening, after the journalists left and the hospital quieted, I sat with Jamila in her room. She was exhausted from the day's events, but she asked me to stay. Will you tell me about my mother? She asked. I remember her, but it's like looking through fog. Tell me what she was really like. So I told her. About Helga's determination to keep the apartment clean despite her illness. About her fierce love for her daughter. About how she searched until her body gave out, and how she died still believing Jamila would return. I told her about the box of possessions Helga had saved, the hairbrush, the school primer, the cloth doll. She kept them for you. She always believed you would come home and want them back. Jamila wept quietly. I wish I could have told her I tried, that I didn't leave on purpose, that I never stopped being her daughter, even when I forgot my name. She knew, I said, though I had no way of knowing if this was true. Mothers know. We sat in silence for a while. Then Jamila asked, why did you keep looking? After so long, why did you care? I thought about this carefully. Because I failed you once. I saw you struggling and I didn't help. I convinced myself someone else would act. And when you disappeared, I realized that someone else never comes. If we want the world to be better, we have to be the ones who act. You kept your promise for 36 years. Yes, that's a long time to carry someone else's burden. It wasn't a burden, I said. It was a privilege. You deserved to be remembered. Your mother deserved to be honored. And I deserved to learn that promises matter, even when they seem impossible to keep. The media frenzy lasted about 2 weeks before the next crisis captured public attention. This was both relief and disappointment. Relief that Jamila could begin to heal in relative privacy, disappointment that her story would be forgotten as quickly as it had been remembered. But some changes, once set in motion, cannot be undone. The social reckoning. The revelation of Jamila's case forced uncomfortable questions that Germany had been avoiding. For decades. How does a child disappear in a functioning society? How does she survive for 36 years in various institutional systems without anyone connecting her to the missing child reports? A government commission was formed to investigate gaps in the social services system. They discovered what we already knew, that post-war Germany had rebuilt its physical infrastructure magnificently while allowing its social infrastructure to remain fractured and inadequate. Children like Jamila, from poor families, from broken homes, from the margins that prosperity left behind, fell through gaps that no one wanted to acknowledge existed. And when they fell, the systems meant to catch them failed in sequential, predictable ways. The Commission's report, published in 2001, made 17 recommendations for reform. Most were eventually implemented. Child welfare agencies gained better coordination across jurisdictions. Missing children databases became computerized and interconnected. Training improved for social workers, teachers, and medical professionals in recognizing and reporting neglect. But these changes came too late for Jamila, too late for her mother, too late for the decades lost to institutional failures and collective indifference. Jamila's recovery, such as it was. The DNA results came back in mid-December, confirming what we already knew. The woman in the hospital bed was definitively Jamila Meyer, born March 3, 1956, missing since November 17, 1964. She moved from acute care to a psychiatric facility specializing in trauma recovery and cognitive rehabilitation. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about helping her regain some stability, though they warned repeatedly that full recovery was impossible. I visited 3 times per week. Sometimes, Jamila recognized me immediately. Sometimes she thought I was her mother. Sometimes she called me by names I did not recognize. People from her lost decades, fragments of identities she had inhabited. Dr. Brenner explained this was normal given her condition. She's trying to integrate 36 years of fragmented experience. Her mind built walls to protect itself, and now we're asking her to take those walls down. It's painful work. The therapy sessions were difficult to witness. Jamila would remember something, a foster family who had been kind or cruel or simply indifferent, and the emotions would overwhelm her. She would rage or weep or withdraw into silence. Then gradually she would resurface, exhausted but intact. "I'm trying," she told me one afternoon in January. "I'm trying to put all the pieces together. But there are so many pieces missing. Whole years I can't. Remember, people whose faces I see but whose names are gone. Did these things happen to me or did I dream them? I don't know anymore." The possessions. In February, Frau Schmidt brought Jamila the box that had been stored in the police archives since 1970. The box containing her mother's few possessions. We opened it together in Jamila's room at the psychiatric facility. Inside, the hairbrush with dark strands still tangled in the bristles, the school primer with careful handwriting, the cloth doll with button eyes, worn but intact. Jamila touched each item carefully, as if they might dissolve. She held the doll against her chest and rocked slightly, making a sound that was not quite crying, not quite keening. "I remember this," she whispered. "Mama made it for my 4th birthday. She used buttons from Papa's old shirt. She said the doll would watch over me when she couldn't. She slept with the doll every night after that. The nurses told me they sometimes heard her speaking to it, having conversations with the mother she had lost twice, once in disappearance, once in death." The father, Herr Meyer, Jamila's father, was located in Munich in March 2001. He was 73 years old, living in a small apartment, working part-time as a building superintendent. The police contacted him to inform him that his daughter had been found. He refused to visit her. "That was a different life," he told the detective. "I left it behind. I made a new start. I can't go back to that." When Jamila learned this, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I understand. The war broke him, and he broke us, and now we're all just broken pieces. Maybe it's better he stays away. I don't think I could carry his guilt along with everything else, but I saw her holding the doll more tightly after that conversation. I saw her eyes drift to the window when visitors arrived, as if some part of her still hoped he might change his mind. He never did. The media returns in April. A documentary filmmaker contacted the hospital requesting permission to tell Jamila's story. The proposal was thoughtful, respectful, focused on systemic failures rather than sensationalism. After much discussion, Jamila agreed to participate. The filming took place over 3 months. The crew was small, unobtrusive, patient with Jamila's good days and bad days. They interviewed me, Frau Schmidt, Dr. Brenner, several of the nurses. They even found Frau Braun, Jamila's elementary school teacher, who wept through her interview. I should have done more, she repeated. I knew that child was drowning. I knew. The documentary, titled The Girl Germany Forgot, aired in November 2001, almost exactly 1 year after Jamila was found. It won several awards. More importantly, it sparked national conversation about child welfare, poverty, and the social contract. But for Jamila, the documentary was difficult. Seeing her story made public, even with her permission, felt like exposure. Everyone knows now, she said. Everyone knows how I failed to save myself. You didn't fail, I told her firmly. The world failed you. You survived. That's not failure. That's courage. The small joys. Not everything was trauma and reckoning. There were moments of unexpected grace. In June, my granddaughter Emma visited Jamila with me. She was 23 now, studying social work at university. She and Jamila talked for hours about music, about books, about the small pleasures of daily life. When Emma left, Jamila smiled, a real smile, the first I had seen. She's lovely. She reminds me of who I might have been if things had been different. In August, Jamila attended a hospital garden party. She wore a new dress, the first new clothing she had chosen herself in decades. She walked through the gardens, touching flowers, smelling herbs, existing. In the moment without the weight of past or future. I had forgotten about gardens, she told me. When you live on the streets, you forget that beautiful things exist. You forget that the world has roses and lavender and sunshine. You forget that you're allowed to enjoy them. In September, Jamila painted a picture in art therapy. Just a simple watercolor of a window with sunlight streaming through. But she was proud of it, and the therapist was impressed by her natural talent. Mama used to draw, Jamila remembered. Nothing fancy, just little sketches on scrap paper, birds mostly, she said. Birds were free in ways people couldn't be. Maybe I got some of her ability. These moments were small, yes, but they were hers. After 36 years of erasure, she was building a self again, piece by fragile piece. The declining health, but the cognitive decline was relentless. By October, Dr. Brenner adjusted his prognosis downward. The dementia was progressing faster than expected, likely accelerated by decades of malnutrition and untreated illness. Jamila's good days became less frequent. She would wake confused about where she was, convinced she needed to get bread for her mother, panicking when she couldn't find Müllerstrasse. The staff learned to speak calmly, to reorient her gently, to remind her she was safe. On bad days, she didn't recognize me at all. She would look at me with frightened eyes and ask why I was there, what I wanted from her. On those days, I would sit quietly in her room, reading aloud from books or newspapers, providing presence without demanding recognition. On good days, she would apologize. I'm sorry I didn't know you. My mind plays tricks. It steals things from me. It's all right, I would tell her. I know you. That's enough. The conversation about dying. In November 2001, exactly 1 year after Jamila was found, we had the conversation neither of us wanted, but both knew was necessary. She was having a good day, lucid and present. We sat in her room watching the November rain against the windows, and she said quietly, I'm dying, aren't I? I could have deflected. could have offered false hope. But we had come too far for lies. Yes, I said. The doctors think you have perhaps 2 or 3 years. Maybe less. She nodded slowly. I thought so. My body feels like it's wearing out, like I used up all my time just surviving and now there's nothing left. I'm sorry, I said. I'm so sorry it wasn't longer. That you didn't have more time to live, really live. It's strange, she said. I had 44 years, but I only really lived 2 of them. The first 8 years with Mama, and this last year here. Everything in between was just enduring. We sat in silence. Then she asked, when I die, will you make sure they bury me next to Mama? I want to be with her again. I want her to know I came back. I promise, I said, making the second promise of my life to a Meyer woman. I'll make sure you're together. She took my hand. Thank you. For everything. For keeping watch. For finding me. For staying even when I don't remember who you are. You gave me back my name. That's everything. The second anniversary, November 17th, 2002, marked 38 years since Jamila disappeared and 2 years since she was found. The psychiatric facility held a small gathering in her honor. Just staff, a few visitors, myself and Emma. Jamila was having a difficult day. She was present enough to know something special was happening but confused about the details. She kept asking when her mother would arrive, when they were going home to Millerstrasse. But there was a moment, brief but clear, when the fog lifted. She looked around at the gathered people and said, "You're all here because of me, because I mattered enough to remember." "Yes," I said. "You mattered. You always mattered." She smiled. Mama would have liked that. She always said I was important even when the world said I wasn't. She was right. Then the fog returned, and she asked again when her mother was coming. But that moment of clarity was enough. She had understood, even briefly, that her life had meaning, that her story mattered, that she was not and had never been forgotten. The final winter. By December 2002, Jamila rarely had good days anymore. The dementia had progressed to the point where she lived mostly in the past, convinced she was still a child, still waiting for her mother to feel better, still trying to find the bakery. The staff continued to care for her with remarkable tenderness. They spoke to her as if she were the child she believed herself to be. They assured her that Mama was resting and would see her soon. They told her she was a good girl, a helpful daughter, that she was safe and loved. And I continued my visits 3 times per week, sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, speaking gently even when she did not know me. I made a promise, I told Emma when she asked why I kept coming. 2 promises, actually. To watch for her, and to make sure she wasn't alone at the end. I'm keeping both. On Christmas Eve, Jamila had a moment of unexpected lucidity. She opened her eyes, saw me sitting beside her, and said clearly, "You're the woman who kept her promise." "Yes," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm keeping it still." "Thank you," she whispered. "Tell Mama I'm coming home soon. Tell her I never stop looking for her either." "I will," I promised, though I knew both women were beyond reach of any message except the one I carried in my heart. She closed her eyes and slipped back into the fog. Jamila Meyer died on March 3, 2003, her 47th birthday. It was a cold morning, the kind of morning that makes you believe winter will never truly end. I was there when she passed, holding her hand, speaking softly about spring coming soon, about gardens waking up, about birds returning. She went peacefully, which was more grace than she had known in most of her life. The funeral. We buried her on March 8th, beside her mother in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Munich. I had arranged everything according to my promise. A simple but dignified service, a headstone that bore both their names, a plot where they could rest together after all the years of separation. The funeral was small. Myself, Emma, several nurses and staff from the psychiatric facility, Frau Schmidt, the detective, Dr. Brenner, a representative from the Child Welfare Reform Commission, and surprisingly, about 40 people we didn't know, strangers who had seen the documentary or read about Jamila's case and felt compelled to bear witness. The priest spoke about lost children and faithful mothers, about society's failures and individual courage, about redemption coming late but still meaning something. But the words that mattered most came from Emma, who had asked to speak. She stood at the graveside, 25 years old, and addressed the gathering. I never met Jamila when she was a child, but my grandmother told me her story from the time I was 7 years old. Every year on November 17th, we lit a candle together and remembered. My grandmother taught me that memory is a form of love, and that keeping watch for someone even when they seem impossibly lost is the most important work we can do. She paused, gathering herself. Jamila's life was stolen from her, not by one villain, but by 1,000 small failures. But in the end, she got her name back. She got to know that her mother never stopped loving her. She got to understand that she mattered enough for someone to spend 36 years watching for her return. That's not nothing, that's everything. I wept quietly as Emma spoke. She had learned the lesson I spent a lifetime learning. She would carry it forward when I was gone. The vigil would continue, transformed, in a new generation that understood the cost of forgetting. The reckoning continues. In the months following Jamila's death, the child welfare reforms continued. The government allocated additional funding. Training programs expanded. Interjurisdictional cooperation improved. Slowly, painfully, the system began to address the gaps that had swallowed Jamila and countless others. But systemic change is slow, and some children were still falling through. In 2004, another case made headlines. A boy from Frankfurt, missing for 8 years, found living in a foster home under a different name. The parallels to Jamila's case were unmistakable. The government recommitted to reform. Jamila's name was invoked in parliamentary debates, in funding proposals, in training materials. She became, in death, a symbol of what we had failed to protect and what we must not fail again. I found this both comforting and deeply sad. She deserved to be more than a symbol. She deserved to have been a woman with a full life, with family and friends and ordinary joys. But if her suffering could prevent others from experiencing the same, then perhaps meaning could be extracted from tragedy. The conversations with strangers. In the years after Jamila's death, people sometimes recognized me from the documentary. They would approach hesitantly in markets or parks, asking if I was the woman who had kept watch for 36 years. I always said yes. And then they would tell me their stories. About the children they worried about but didn't act to help. About the neighbors they wondered about but never checked on. About the small moments when they could have intervened but convinced themselves it wasn't there. Responsibility. I saw your documentary, a woman told me in 2005, and I realized I was making the same mistake. There's a child in my building, always alone, always thin. I kept thinking someone else would help. But I'm someone else to everyone else. So I called social services. They investigated. The mother was struggling with addiction. The child is in foster care now, but at least she's safe. At least she won't disappear. These conversations multiplied. Dozens, then hundreds. People who had learned from Jamila's story that looking away is not neutral. That silence is not innocence. That the question is never who will help, but will I help? This I began to understand was Jamila's true legacy. Not policy reforms or government commissions, though those mattered, but individual people choosing to see, to act, to refuse the comfort of assuming someone else will intervene. Emma's work. My granddaughter Emma graduated with her social work degree in 2004. She specialized in child welfare, working with at-risk families in the same district where Jamila had lived 4 decades earlier. The buildings had been renovated, the streets had been renamed. But poverty still existed, and families still struggled, and children still needed advocates who would refuse to look away. Emma became that advocate. She carried Jamila's story with her, not as a burden, but as a guide. When she was tempted to close a case too quickly, she remembered. When she was overwhelmed and wanted to believe that someone else would handle it, she remembered. When she was tired and wondered if her work mattered, she remembered. Oma taught me, she told a colleague once, That we can't save everyone, but we can keep watch. We can refuse to forget. And sometimes that's enough to make the difference between a child lost and a child found. I attended Emma's wedding in 2007. She asked me to speak, and I told the assembled guests about promises and vigilance and the responsibility we carry for each other. It was the last public speech I gave. My hands shook too much after that. My voice grew too weak. But I had said what needed saying. The mother's voice. Sometimes in the years after Jamila died, I would return to the cemetery and sit between the two graves. I would speak to Helga Meyer, updating her on the daughter she had never stopped believing in. She came home, I would say. Not the way you hoped. Not in time for you to hold her. But she came home. And she knew you never forgot her. She knew you waited. That mattered to her. It gave her peace at the end. I like to imagine that Helga could hear me. That somewhere, however we continue after death, she knew her. Vigil had been kept. That her daughter had been found. That the promise made to a dying woman in 1970 had been fulfilled in 2000. Perhaps this was sentimental. Perhaps it was the softening of an old woman's mind. The need to believe that suffering must have meaning. But I chose to believe anyway. Faith, I had learned, is sometimes just the decision to act as if hope is reasonable, even when evidence suggests otherwise. The final years I turned 80 in 2012. My body was failing in the expected ways. Joints that protested movement, eyes that needed stronger glasses, ears that missed parts of conversations. But my mind remained clear enough to remember, which was all I needed. I continued lighting a candle every November 17th. But now I lit it not just for the day Jamila disappeared, but also for the day she was found. A remembrance of loss, yes, but also a celebration of recovery. Both mattered. Both were part of her story. Emma came to light the candle with me each year, sometimes bringing her own children, my great-grandchildren, a new generation who would carry the story forward. I told them about Jamila, about their great-great-aunt Helga, about the promise that shaped my life. Why did you keep looking so long? My youngest great-grandson asked when he was 7. Because someone needed to, I said. Because promises matter, even when they're hard. Especially when they're hard. And because I couldn't live with myself if I forgot. He thought about this seriously, then nodded. I'll remember her too, so you can rest. And I realized he was right. The burden I had carried for nearly 50 years could finally be shared, distributed across generations, transformed from individual vigil into collective memory. The letters. In my final years, I received letters from around the world. People who had heard Jamila's story and been moved by it. People who had started their own vigils, keeping watch for lost children in their communities. People who had found the courage to act instead of assume someone else would. A woman from Austria wrote that she had started a volunteer program to visit isolated elderly people, ensuring no one died alone and forgotten as Helga Meyer nearly had. A man from France wrote that he had reconciled with his estranged daughter after years of silence, realizing that time lost cannot be recovered. A teacher from Spain wrote that she now paid closer attention to her students, looking for signs of neglect or abuse, refusing to accept that troubled children are someone else's responsibility. These letters sustained me. They proved that Jamila's story, born from tragedy and institutional failure, had somehow generated light. That meaning could be made even from the most painful experiences. That keeping watch, even when it seems futile, can change everything. I died on November 17th, 2015, exactly 51 years after Jamila disappeared. My family found this timing both eerie and appropriate. I like to think I chose it. Held on until the anniversary, completing the circle. Emma spoke at my funeral, telling the assembled mourners about her grandmother who kept a promise for 36 years, and then kept living that promise for 15 more. She taught me, Emma said, that we're not required to fix everything, but we are required to care. We're not guaranteed success, but we are obligated to try, and we can't save everyone, but we can refuse to forget anyone. She paused, then continued. My grandmother carried Jamila Meyer's story for 51 years. She carried Helga Meyer's grief for 45 years. And she never complained about the weight. She said it was an honor, a privilege, a reminder of what matters most. And what matters most, Emma concluded, is that we see each other, that we refuse to look away when someone is drowning, that we keep watch for those who might otherwise disappear, that we remember that every person, no matter how poor or troubled or seemingly insignificant, deserves to be found. They buried me between my husband and my children's father, in a cemetery on the other side of Munich from where Jamila and Helga rest. But Emma arranged for a small plaque to be placed at Jamila's grave, in memory of Jamila Meyer, 1956-2003, and Helga Meyer, 1932-1970. Mother and daughter, separated for 36 years, reunited in death, and in memory of all who refused to forget them. Every November 17th, Emma lights candles at both graves, Jamila's and mine. She brings her children. She tells the story. She continues the vigil, and she has taught her children to watch for those who might otherwise disappear, to see the struggling neighbor, to notice the child who comes to school in inadequate clothing, to act instead of assuming someone else will, to keep promises even when they take decades to fulfill. If you are reading this story, if you are a woman who has lived long enough to see the world change in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking, then you understand something essential. Life does not always deliver the endings we want, Jamila Meyer did not get to rebuild her life. She did not get decades of peace to compensate for decades of suffering. She did not experience the full recovery we wish for every broken person. But she got something perhaps equally important. She got her name back. She got to know that her mother never stopped loving her. She got to understand that someone cared enough to watch for 36 years. She got dignity at the end. And sometimes, that is enough. Not perfect. Not what we would choose. But enough.